The sound of metal hitting dirt at 6 a.m. was my first clue that my peaceful lakeside retirement was about to become a war zone. Standing at my kitchen window with a steaming cup of coffee, I watched in disbelief as my HOA board president, Karen Whitfield, directed 3 workers to drive fence posts directly across the path I'd used to reach the lake for 15 years. What I didn't know yet was that this wasn't just about blocking my access to the water. It was about something much bigger that would eventually cost her everything she'd worked to control. Let me take you back to how this all started. 3 months earlier, I'd inherited this beautiful lakeside property from my uncle in Willowbrook Estates, a quiet community of about 40 homes surrounding Crystal Lake. The house sat on a double lot with direct water access, a rare feature in our HOA since most homes were set back from the shoreline. My uncle had been one of the original developers back in 1987, and his property came with what the HOA documents called perpetual lake access rights. I should mention that I'm not exactly the retirement type Karen expected. At 58, I just sold my engineering consulting firm and moved here for some peace and quiet. I drove a modest Honda, kept my yard neat, and minded my own business. But apparently, that wasn't good enough for Karen. Karen Whitfield was the kind of woman who measured her worth in the number of violations she could cite in a single afternoon. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, pastel pantsuits that never showed a wrinkle, and a voice that could cut through steel when she was displeased. She'd been HOA president for 8 consecutive years, running unopposed because, frankly, nobody else wanted the job. Her husband, Tom, was a quiet accountant who seemed to disappear whenever Karen started her enforcement campaigns. The trouble began during my first HOA meeting in September. I'd attended to introduce myself and learn about any upcoming community projects. The meeting was held in Karen's spacious living room, where she sat behind a folding table like a judge at a trial. About 12 other residents filled the mismatched chairs arranged in neat rows. "Before we begin tonight's agenda," Karen announced, adjusting her reading glasses, "I want to address some concerns about property maintenance in Section 4. Her eyes found mine across the room. "We have new residents who may not understand our community standards." I shifted in my uncomfortable metal chair, the feeling of being singled out settling over me like a cold fog. "For instance," she continued, her voice taking on that particularly sharp tone I'd come to dread, "dock maintenance. Some lake access points have become unsightly." My dock was solid cedar, professionally maintained, and barely 5 years old. Uncle Jim had replaced it just before his passing. But as Karen's gaze lingered on me, I realized facts weren't going to matter here. Additionally, she pressed on, "We need to discuss proper watercraft storage. Boats, kayaks, and other equipment must be stored according to our guidelines, not simply left wherever is convenient." This was news to me. I kept my small fishing boat on a lift behind my dock, exactly where my uncle had kept his for over a decade. I raised my hand tentatively. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm Tom Morrison. I inherited the property on Lakeshore Drive. Could you point me to the specific guidelines you're referring to? I want to make sure I'm in compliance." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. I'll have a full compliance packet delivered to you tomorrow. I trust you'll find it educational." After the meeting, as residents filed out offering polite welcomes and sympathy for my uncle's passing, Karen approached me. Up close, I could smell her heavy floral perfume mixing with the scent of vanilla candles from her living room. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand that we take our community standards very seriously here. Your uncle, God rest his soul, had a rather casual approach to HOA guidelines in his later years. I'm sure you'll want to start fresh." "Of course," I replied, though something in her tone made my engineer's brain start calculating angles and structural loads, mental habits that kicked in whenever I sensed a problem that needed solving. Good. I've already scheduled a property inspection for next week. Just routine, you understand. We want to make sure everything is up to code. That night, I spent hours reading through my property deed and the original HOA covenants. Everything seemed straightforward. I had clear lake access rights, and my dock was grandfathered in under the original agreements. But something about Karen's demeanor suggested she had different ideas about my rights. What I found in my uncle's papers the next morning would explain everything and set us on a collision course neither of us could have imagined. The compliance packet Karen delivered was 47 pages long and appeared to be specifically tailored to my property. She'd photographed my dock, my boat lift, my kayak storage, even my outdoor furniture, and cross-referenced each item with increasingly obscure HOA regulations. Some of these rules seemed to have been written last month. The centerpiece of her case was a regulation about visual pollution from waterfront perspectives. According to Karen's interpretation, my dock and boat lift created an unsightly obstruction when viewed from her property, which sat on a hill about 200 yards away. Never mind that 8 other homes had similar setups apparently. Mine was the problem. But here's where it got interesting. Buried in my uncle's papers, I'd found a copy of the original property surveys and HOA agreements from 1987. My uncle hadn't just been a resident, he'd been one of the 3 founding members who'd established the HOA and written the original covenants. And according to those documents, my property had what lawyers call superior rights, meaning my lake access predated the HOA's authority to regulate it. I spent the next 2 weeks researching property law and had a real estate attorney review the documents. Her assessment was clear. Karen didn't have the authority to restrict my lake access, and my boat setup was completely legal under both the original covenants and local ordinances. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to handle things diplomatically. I requested a meeting with Karen to discuss the inspection results. We met on a crisp October morning at the community clubhouse, a small building that served as our unofficial HOA headquarters. Karen had arranged the meeting like a formal hearing, with herself behind a table and me sitting across from her like a defendant. She'd even brought a tape recorder. "Mr. Morrison," she began, consulting a thick folder, "I've completed my review of your property's compliance status. I'm afraid there are several serious violations that must be addressed immediately." She slid a formal notice across the table. The document listed 17 separate violations, each with a recommended fine ranging from $50 to $500. The total exceeded $4,000. "This has to be a joke," I said, scanning the list. "You're fining me for having a mailbox that's inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. It's the same mailbox that's been there for 15 years. "The regulations have been updated," Karen replied coolly. "All residents are expected to maintain current compliance regardless of previous arrangements." I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. The morning sun, streaming through the clubhouse windows, highlighted the satisfied gleam in her eyes. This wasn't about regulations, this was personal. "Karen," I said, switching to her first name deliberately, "let's cut through the bureaucracy here. What's this really about? My uncle lived here peacefully for decades. I'm keeping the property in exactly the same condition. So, what's the problem?" Her composure cracked slightly, and for a moment I saw something like genuine anger flash across her face. "The problem, Mr. Morrison, is that some people seem to think the rules don't apply to them. Your uncle had an understanding with previous board members. But I'm the president now, and under my leadership, everyone follows the same rules." I pulled out my own folder and placed the original HOA documents on the table between us. "Speaking of rules, I think you should see these." The color drained from Karen's face as she recognized the documents. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the property survey. These are the original covenants, I explained calmly. According to these documents, my property has grandfathered lake access rights that predate the HOA's regulatory authority. My uncle was one of the founding members who established this community. These violations you've listed? Most of them target features that are specifically protected under the original agreements. Karen set down the documents and fixed me with a stare that could have frozen the lake in July. Mr. Morrison, I don't know where you got these historical curiosities, but the current HOA board operates under updated regulations. These old papers have no bearing on current enforcement. Actually, they do. I've had them reviewed by a real estate attorney. Your authority to regulate my lakefront access is extremely limited, and most of these fines are unenforceable. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Karen's tape recorder hummed quietly on the table. Finally, she spoke, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Mr. Morrison, I think you're going to find that living in this community is much more pleasant when you work with the HOA instead of against it. I'd hate for your property to become the subject of additional scrutiny. There it was not quite a threat, but close enough. I gathered my documents and stood to leave. Karen, I've tried to handle this reasonably. But if you want to make this a legal issue, I'm prepared for that too. As I walked toward the door, she called after me. Oh, and Mr. Morrison? The board will be voting next week on some new safety regulations for lake access. I think you'll find them very interesting. But I had no idea just how far she was willing to go to win this war, or that her next move would force me to get creative with my engineering background. The new safety regulations Karen had mentioned turned out to be a complete ban on private docks, extending more than 10 feet from the shoreline. Given that Crystal Lake had a shallow, muddy bottom near the shore, a 10-foot dock would leave boats sitting in about 18 inches of water, essentially making them unusable. The regulation passed the HOA board vote 3-2, with Karen casting the deciding vote. She'd held the meeting on a Tuesday afternoon when most residents were at work, and only sent out the notice 48 hours in advance. By the time I learned about it, the rule was already in effect with a 30-day compliance deadline. I spent that evening walking the shoreline, counting docks. 11 properties had lake access, and 9 of them had docks extending beyond the new limit. But as I suspected, the enforcement would be selective. Karen's enforcement strategy became clear when violation notices went out the following week. Only 3 properties received citations, and mine topped the list. The other 2 recipients were Ed Murphy, a retired firefighter who'd had a running dispute with Karen over his vegetable garden, and Susan Chen, a single mother who'd recently challenged Karen's decision to hire her nephew for landscape maintenance at an inflated rate. Apparently, crossing Karen came with consequences. I decided it was time to fight fire with fire. My first move was to request copies of all HOA meeting minutes for the past 2 years, along with the board's financial records. As a member in good standing, I had the right to review these documents. Karen's response was swift and predictable. She claimed the records were being reorganized and would be available soon. While waiting for the records that would probably never come, I started attending every HOA board meeting and bringing my own tape recorder. Karen's discomfort was palpable as I sat in the front row, taking detailed notes on every decision and expenditure. The real breakthrough came when I started talking to my neighbors. Most residents had stories about Karen's enforcement campaigns, but they'd never compared notes. Mrs. Patterson told me about being fined for excessive Christmas decorations, 3 wreaths, and some tasteful lights. The Johnsons faced citations for parking their RV in their own driveway for more than 72 hours. Young couple Sarah and Mike had been hit with landscaping violations because their flower garden didn't match the approved plant list that seemed to change monthly. But the most interesting conversation was with Bob Hernandez, who'd served on the HOA board until the previous year. "I quit because I couldn't take Karen's power trips anymore," he told me over coffee at the local diner. She'd been pushing for years to get control of the lakefront properties. Something about developing them into a community beach area. That's when the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about regulations or community standards. Karen wanted to force lakefront property owners to abandon their water access so she could claim it for the HOA. With most of us gone, she could then propose a development project that would benefit the community and probably line her own pockets. "Bob," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee, "do you know if Karen has any connections to local development companies?" His laugh was bitter. "Her brother owns Whitfield Development. They specialize in community recreational facilities. Pools, beaches, clubhouses, that sort of thing." Now we were getting somewhere. I spent the next week researching Whitfield Development and their recent projects. They had a pattern of working with HOAs to develop underutilized waterfront areas into community amenities. The projects were always expensive, typically requiring special assessments from homeowners, and always managed by Whitfield Development at premium rates. Karen's plan was becoming clear: force out the lakefront property owners, claim the water access for the HOA, then hire her brother to develop an expensive community beach project that would generate ongoing management fees and boost property values, at least on paper. But I wasn't going to make it that easy for her. My engineering background had taught me that every system has weak points and every problem has multiple solutions. If Karen wanted to play regulatory games, I'd show her what real regulations looked like. I started by filing Freedom of Information Act requests with the county for all permits and inspections related to HOA common areas. I also requested environmental impact studies for the lake area and historical surveys of the property boundaries. If Karen wanted to claim authority over lake access, she'd better make sure the HOA was in perfect compliance with county, state, and federal regulations. What I found in those documents would give me all the ammunition I needed. The HOA's community areas hadn't been properly permitted in over 6 years. Their septic system for the clubhouse was overdue for inspection. Most interesting of all, the HOA had been claiming tax exemptions for environmental conservation of lake areas while simultaneously planning to develop them. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report and sent copies to the county planning department, the state environmental agency, and the IRS. Then I waited. Karen's response to my regulatory assault came faster than I expected. 3 days after my government filings, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The HOA was placing a lion on my property for ongoing violations and administrative costs totaling $12,847. The gloves were officially off. But Karen had no idea that her next move would give me the perfect opportunity to show her and the entire community exactly what happens when you corner an engineer with too much time on his hands. The morning I woke up to find survey stakes driven into my front yard was the moment I realized Karen had escalated beyond petty a harassment. She was now claiming that my property boundaries were incorrect and that a portion of my lakefront access actually belonged to HOA common area. The surveyor's report, conveniently conducted by a company owned by another Whitfield family member, concluded that my dock was built on community property. This was bold, even for Karen. Property boundary disputes require legal expertise, significant financial resources, and months or years to resolve. But it would also cloud my property title, making it nearly impossible to sell or refinance until the matter was settled. It was a calculated move designed to force me into either expensive litigation or surrender. I was studying the bogus survey report when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see Karen standing on my front porch, dressed in her usual pastel armor and carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained more legal threats. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. The November air was sharp with the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison. I trust you received the survey results?" "I received them," I replied evenly. "Interesting how your family's surveying company reached conclusions that contradict 35 years of recorded property records." Karen's smile was sharp enough to etch glass. "Professional surveys sometimes reveal historical inaccuracies. I'm sure you understand the importance of having accurate property boundaries. What I understand is that you're trying to steal part of my land. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Morrison. I hope you're prepared to back up statements like that." She stepped closer, and I caught the familiar scent of her cloying floral perfume, mixed with something else, the sharp smell of desperation disguised as confidence. "Actually, I wanted to discuss a possible solution to our ongoing disagreements. The HOA board has authorized me to make you an offer." She opened her portfolio and pulled out a typed document. "We're prepared to purchase your entire property at fair market value. You'd be free to relocate somewhere more suitable to your lifestyle preferences." I skimmed the document. The offer was about 30% below current market value and included a clause requiring me to pay all legal costs associated with the boundary dispute regardless of the outcome. "This is insulting, Karen. It's generous, considering the legal complications surrounding your property. Boundary disputes can be very expensive to resolve, and there's always the possibility that our survey is correct." I handed the document back to her. My answer is no. Her mask of professional courtesy slipped for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "That's unfortunate. I was hoping we could resolve this amicably. But if you insist on fighting the HOA, you should know that we have significant resources at our disposal." Legal battles can drag on for years, Mr. Morrison. They can be very stressful. Is that a threat? It's a reality. Small disputes have a way of growing into much larger problems. Property lines, for instance. Environmental violations. Code enforcement actions. Sometimes these things snowball in ways nobody expected. The morning sun cast long shadows across my yard, and I could hear the distant sound of construction equipment starting up somewhere in the neighborhood. Karen's carefully styled hair barely moved in the crisp breeze. "You know what, Karen? You're absolutely right. Sometimes small disputes do snowball in unexpected ways." Something in my tone made her take a small step backward. "I'm glad you're beginning to see reason." "Oh, I see everything very clearly now. Including the fact that your brother's development company has been bidding on a lake access project for this community. Including the financial irregularities in HOA spending over the past 3 years. Including the fact that your family seems to benefit quite nicely from HOA decisions." Karen's face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup. "I don't know what you're implying, but..." "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. And those facts are now part of several ongoing investigations by county and state agencies." For the first time since I'd met her, Karen Whitfield looked genuinely rattled. Her portfolio trembled slightly in her hands. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mr. Morrison. The HOA board will not be intimidated by frivolous complaints to government agencies. We'll see about that." She turned to leave, then paused at the edge of my porch. "One more thing, Mr. Morrison. The board will be voting next week on emergency lake access restrictions due to safety concerns. I think you'll find the new regulations very comprehensive." After she left, I stood in my doorway, watching her walk back to her SUV, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown timer. The construction sounds were getting closer, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the lake. I grabbed my jacket and walked down to the water to investigate. What I found there made my blood boil and gave me the perfect inspiration for the most audacious engineering solution of my career. Karen's emergency safety restrictions turned out to be a complete closure of all lake access pending a comprehensive environmental and safety study. But the real insult was the 6-foot chain-link fence she'd had installed overnight along the entire shoreline, cutting off every lakefront property owner from the water. The fence was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. It ran along what Karen claimed was the HOA's property line, but it effectively blocked access to docks, boat lifts, and even the walking paths that residents had used for decades. Signs every 50 feet proclaimed HOA common area, no trespassing, in bold red letters. I stood at the end of my backyard, looking at the fence that now separated me from the lake I'd enjoyed for only a few months. The morning mist was rising off the water, like ghosts of my peaceful retirement dreams. My dock was visible beyond the fence, but it might as well have been on another planet. Other lakefront residents had gathered along the fence line, their voices a mixture of anger and disbelief. Ed Murphy was examining the fence posts with the methodical attention of someone planning demolition. "This has got to be illegal," Susan Chen was saying, her usually calm demeanor cracking. "She can't just fence off the entire lake." "Actually, she can if the property boundaries support her claim," said Jim Patterson, who'd practiced real estate law before retiring. "It'll take months to challenge this in court, and in the meantime, we're all locked out." That's when I noticed something that made my engineer's brain start spinning with possibilities. The fence was well built and properly installed, but it had one critical flaw: it only blocked ground-level access. Karen's contractors had focused on preventing people from walking to the water, but they'd never considered three-dimensional solutions. More importantly, the fence clearly established where Karen claimed the HOA property began. If she was wrong about those boundaries, and I was increasingly certain she was then, her fence was built on private property, which would make it an illegal structure subject to immediate removal. But proving the boundary dispute could take months. I needed a faster solution, one that would restore my lake access while I fought the larger legal battle. That afternoon, I drove to the county planning office and spent 3 hours reviewing every survey, property record, and environmental study filed for Willowbrook Estates since 1987. What I discovered was even better than I'd hoped. The original development plans included a 50-foot environmental setback from the high water mark of Crystal Lake. This setback was designed to protect water quality and prevent erosion, and it was a condition of the community's original zoning approval. According to these plans, no permanent structures, including fences, could be built within that setback area. Karen's fence was built approximately 20 feet from the water's edge, placing it squarely within the protected environmental zone. I made copies of everything and drove straight to the county code enforcement office. "I need to file a complaint about an illegal structure," I told the receptionist. The code enforcement officer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet Rodriguez, reviewed my documents with the efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible zoning violation. "This is pretty clear-cut," she said after studying the environmental setback requirements. "That fence is definitely in violation. We'll issue a stop work order immediately and require removal within 10 days. What happens if they don't comply? Daily fines starting at $500, escalating to $1,000 per day after the first week. Plus, we can remove the structure at the property owner's expense." I thanked Janet and drove home with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Karen had finally overplayed her hand. But as I turned into my driveway, I saw Karen's SUV parked in front of my house. She was standing on my front porch with 2 men in suits, one carrying a briefcase, the other holding what looked like legal documents. The smile on her face told me that she wasn't done fighting yet. What I didn't know was that her next move would finally push me to do something so audacious, so perfectly engineered, that it would become neighborhood legend for years to come. The men with Karen turned out to be a process server and her attorney, a sharp-dressed corporate lawyer named Richard Blackwood, who specialized in property disputes. The legal papers they served me with were a temporary restraining order prohibiting me from interfering with HOA operations and a lawsuit seeking damages for harassment and intentional disruption of community governance. Karen stood behind her legal team like a general reviewing her troops, her satisfaction practically radiating from her perfectly pressed pantsuit. "Mr. Morrison," Attorney Blackwood said in the polished tone of someone accustomed to intimidating homeowners, "my client has documented a pattern of harassment and interference that has disrupted the normal operation of the Willowbrook Estates, HOA. This restraining order prohibits you from attending HOA meetings, filing complaints with government agencies, or contacting other residents about HOA matters." I read through the legal documents while they waited. The restraining order was temporary, but it was broad enough to effectively silence me while Karen pushed through whatever final phase of her plan she had in mind. "This is ridiculous," I said. "Filing legitimate complaints with government agencies isn't harassment. It's exercising my rights as a citizen." "That will be for the court to decide," Blackwood replied smoothly. "In the meantime, any violation of this order could result in contempt charges and possible jail time." Karen stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "Mr. Morrison, I tried to handle this reasonably. I offered you multiple opportunities to work with the HOA instead of against it. But you chose confrontation over cooperation. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." After they left, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the legal papers and the view of the lake I could no longer access. The fence stretched across my view like a scar, and I could see Karen's house on the hill, overlooking the water like a fortress commanding the battlefield. That's when my phone rang. It was Janet Rodriguez from Code Enforcement. "Mr. Morrison, I wanted to give you a heads up. The HOA filed an appeal of our fence violation order, and they've got some high-powered legal representation. The appeal hearing is set for next month, which means the fence stays up pending the outcome." "Can they do that?" "Unfortunately, yes. Their attorney filed for an emergency injunction, claiming the fence is necessary for public safety. It's a delaying tactic, but it's legal." After I hung up, I walked out to my backyard and stared at the fence that now defined the limits of my world. The November afternoon was crisp and clear, with the kind of bright blue sky that made the lake sparkle like diamonds. My dock sat on the other side of the fence, empty and mocking. That's when the idea hit me. Karen had successfully blocked my ground-level access to the lake, and she'd tied up my legal challenges with expensive litigation that could drag on for months. But she'd made one crucial error in her planning. She'd assumed I would fight her on her terms, using conventional solutions. She'd forgotten that I was an engineer. Engineers don't just solve problems, we find elegant solutions that accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. And I was looking at a problem that required some very creative engineering. The next morning, I drove to the county planning office and filed an application for a residential construction permit. The project I described was perfectly legal, didn't require HOA approval since it was entirely on my own property, and would accomplish everything I needed to restore my lake access while teaching Karen an unforgettable lesson about the consequences of underestimating an engineer too much, time, and a legitimate grievance. But before I could break ground on my masterpiece, Karen made one final move that convinced me she deserved everything I was about to give her. The morning I found Karen standing in my backyard with a real estate photographer was the moment I realized her plan had been much more ambitious than I'd imagined. She wasn't just trying to force me out, she was already preparing to market my property. I'd been awakened by voices outside my bedroom window and looked out to see Karen directing a professional photographer to capture good angles of my dock and waterfront access. They'd apparently climbed over the fence she'd installed, making them trespassers on what was definitely my property, regardless of any boundary disputes. I threw on clothes and marched outside, my bare feet cold against the November grass. "What the hell are you doing on my property?" Karen didn't even have the grace to look embarrassed. The photographer, a nervous-looking young man with expensive equipment, glanced between us uncertainly. "Mr. Morrison, we're simply documenting the current condition of the disputed property area. For insurance purposes, you understand. This is my backyard. You're trespassing." "Actually," she said, consulting a folder she carried, according to our latest survey, this waterfront area extends into HOA Common Space. We're documenting unauthorized improvements to community property." The photographer was now backing slowly toward the fence, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to unfold. "Karen, I'm warning you. Get off my property right now, or I'm calling the police." Her smile was arctic. "Please do. I think they'll be very interested in the harassment complaint I've already filed. Did you know that threatening behavior can result in additional restraining order provisions?" That's when I noticed the small recording device in her hand. She'd been trying to provoke me into saying or doing something that would support her legal case. "You're unbelievable. I'm thorough, Mr. Morrison. When the HOA takes control of this waterfront area, we want proper documentation of its condition. The community deserves to know what we're inheriting." The photographer had reached the fence and was awkwardly trying to climb over it with his camera equipment. Karen watched him struggle with the detached amusement of someone who'd never done physical work in her life. "You know what I think is really happening here?" I said, stepping closer to her recording device. "I think you've been planning this property grab for months, maybe years. The enforcement campaign, the bogus survey, the fence, it's all been designed to devalue lakefront properties so the HOA can claim them cheaply. That's a very serious accusation. I hope you can prove it." "Oh, I can. Bank records, email communications between you and your brother's development company, HOA meeting minutes that weren't properly recorded. I've been building quite a comprehensive case." For the first time, Karen's confidence seemed to waver. "You're fishing, Mr. Morrison, and you're violating the restraining order by discussing HOA matters." "No, I'm discussing a criminal conspiracy to defraud homeowners. That's not an HOA matter, that's a felony." The photographer had finally made it over the fence and was hurrying away across the common area like a man escaping a crime scene. Karen and I stood alone in my backyard, the lake glittering behind the chain-link barrier she'd erected. "You think you're so clever?" she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But you have no idea how deep this goes or how many people you're really fighting. The Whitfield family has been part of this community for generations. We have relationships you can't imagine and resources you can't match. Is that supposed to scare me? It's supposed to wake you up to reality. You can't win this fight, Mr. Morrison. The best thing you can do is take the buyout offer and start over somewhere else." That's when she made the mistake that sealed her fate. "Besides," she continued, her arrogance overcoming her caution, "by the time all the legal challenges are resolved, this property will be underwater anyway. The county is planning to raise the lake level for flood control, and most of these old lakefront lots will be in the new flood zone. Your dock, your boat lift, probably half your backyard, all of it will be condemned as a safety hazard." The pieces clicked into place. Karen hadn't just been planning to grab the lakefront properties, she'd been coordinating with county officials to justify the seizure through eminent domain for flood control. The raised lake level would flood existing docks and force homeowners to abandon their water access, clearing the way for her brother's development project. "That's why you've been so confident about the legal challenges," I said. "You already know how this is going to end." Karen's smile returned, cold and satisfied. "I know that sometimes people get in over their heads, Mr. Morrison. The smart ones learned to swim with the current instead of fighting it. After she left, I sat on my back porch, studying the fence that blocked my access to the lake and thinking about everything she'd revealed. Karen's plan was elegant in its corruption. Use HOA harassment to weaken property values, coordinate with county officials to create justification for eminent domain, then have her brother's company swoop in to develop the abandoned waterfront into a profitable community amenity. It was also about to backfire spectacularly. Because while Karen had been busy with her conspiracy, I'd been finalizing the permits for a project that would solve all my problems while giving her a front-row seat to watch her carefully laid plans crumble. The county building department had approved my construction permit that afternoon, and my contractor was starting work the next morning. Karen was about to learn what happens when you corner an engineer who's had enough of playing defense. The sound of heavy construction equipment at dawn was music to my ears, but I could tell from the frantic phone calls echoing across the lake that Karen didn't share my appreciation for the industrial symphony. She was standing on her deck in her bathrobe, her perfectly styled hair in curlers, shouting into her cell phone while pointing dramatically toward my property. My contractor, Pete Kowalski, was a master craftsman who specialized in challenging residential projects. When I'd explained what I wanted to build, he'd stared at my engineering drawings for 10 minutes before breaking into a grin that could have powered the neighborhood. "This is either brilliant or completely insane," he'd said. "Either way, I'm in."